Hello and welcome to our podcast, Tales from the CyberLab. My name's Adam Myers and I'm the sales director here at CyberLab, and I'll be your host for today. Joining me is Milad from Guardsix. Welcome.
Hey, Adam. Pleasure to be here.
Well, yeah, great to have you. Can you maybe just explain a little bit about your role and what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Sure, with pleasure. So I'm the Chief Product Officer over here at Guardsix, and you could say I use my 20 years-ish of experience in cybersecurity, having started as a practitioner myself, to build products and services that help defenders to detect and respond to cyber threats as they happen in their environment together with my team.
Amazing. Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about geopolitics today. So I guess, Milad, to set the foundations, how has the evolving geopolitical landscape changed the cyber threat environment for organizations? And I guess what feels materially different now compared to a few years ago?
You know what is fascinating in our industry? Every year, the vendor community pops up with their predictions. Actually, they first start with their look back of the year, and it's typically along the lines of, look how horrible the world was. And then they give a prediction to the next year, which is, look how worse it will get. Unfortunately, that's the reality that many of us are facing, though. So if I look into the threat landscape, there's four themes that I see. The first one is identity-led compromises, right? So identity is the access into the battlefield, right? And what is important, I think, for us to be aware there is attackers don't break in necessarily anymore like they used to. They log in, right? They find their credentials, they find the identity details, and as simple as that, they log into the environments. The second one is persistency and stealth operations. Someone very famously once said, it's not a matter of if, but when, right? So it's the mindset of assume breach, assume you're already compromised, you're already breached, right? And you will find patterns around that, right? These are slow and stealthy attacks, quiet, high context operations that are designed to be undetected by nature. Third one would be attacks are becoming more disruptive and propagating attacks itself, right? So the impact is the objective for many of these large-scale attacks that we are seeing. And when they happen, they are typically very fast-moving, high impact, and often also coordinated with real-world events, right? And that is especially true when you look into some of the activities we are seeing from Russian threat actors that are working, quote unquote, hand in hand together with the military arm. Right, we are in the brink of a hybrid warfare there, right? And I guess the fourth major theme that I see is just like we as defenders are looking for ways to incorporate new technologies, right? And all the acronyms that are existing there, from large language models to Gen AI and all that stuff. Well, attackers are not waiting either, right? Attackers are also doing the same. And we start seeing the first signs and evidences of AI-based attacks in the world.
Yeah. I think with that, like the role of AI is probably making things like larger on scale, so we can kind of like push that out even more. And with things like military grade tools that you probably see in sort of geopolitical scenarios, it's like you said, it goes hand in hand with sort of the hybrid warfare at the same time. But the tooling is obviously a lot more sophisticated, along with AI and how that can sort of add weight to those incidents. It feels like it's even harder now to sort of defend against in those sort of real world attacks.
Absolutely. If you think about it, we come from an industry, right? Go back to antivirus era, where we were providing signatures, right, on a regular basis to the organizations, right? And the signature was a known quantity, right? So you knew something very specific would happen Well, if we were to detect that very specific thing, then we could also prevent that. Then we said, oh, wait a minute, it's not just about this one line of a signature. There's like behaviors and patterns that we need to recognize. When we went to that transition as an industry, we said, well, we probably want to do this much quicker, right? And that's like the era where we said, well, waiting for a DAC file is not good enough, right? So the vendors in our industry, we said, hey, what does that mean in terms of like near real-time detections? But now if you think about it in the era of AI-based attacks, you actually need to think about not just near real time, but you need to think about how do you actually get to a real-time state, and also how do you build the right security controls across your people, process, and technologies that can adapt, just like the AI will adapt as it learns and fails breaking into the environment.
Yeah. And you mentioned around a assumed breach as like, well, that's where we should sort of work from. So our pen test team do a lot of testing, and we start from that point. And I think it's something maybe if you could just expand on that, because I think a lot of people don't test that within their sort of instant response plans, and perhaps they should be starting there to sort of see how far a hacker could potentially move within their environment. Do you think that's something that our listeners should take away from this first topic?
For sure. I think what is important is, right, we sometimes tend to think of, well, it is only a technology choice that we need to take, or it's only the deployment of the technology, or it's only the incident response process. Well, it's only if we were to put all the SOC analysts into a virtual room or physical room and train them, we are done. Right? That's not the real world. That's also not how attackers think. And that's why, as long as we think that way, attackers will always have the upper hand. We need to flip the game here, right? We need to embrace the way, in many ways, attackers are thinking we're entrepreneurial on getting the mission done. We need to think the same way, which is how do we actually day in, day out stress test our own systems? How do we actually think of breaking in? If we were tomorrow ask a SOC analyst, a threat hunter in our organization or within our partner, say, hey, break in, right? Let's
Yep.
simulate our incident response plan. Let's understand what actually would trigger in our systems. Let's not tell the entire organization that we're doing it in order to validate if a critical situation happens, that really someone wakes up at 3 a.m. to pick up the phone or pick up their laptop and get the job done.
Yeah, yeah. And we see that a lot with the tabletop exercises that we actually do and carry out, is that we stress test the board, for example, and that's a good starting point of, who actually releases the PR if there's a breach, and who updates sort of clients as well. And all those scenarios tend to unravel a little bit of sort of gaps of whose responsibility is what and who sort of step in and do things. I think again, what you're saying there is sort of stress test that and see it in the sort of a real environment of how you actually would respond in those specific incidents. Yeah. So leading into our second topic, looking specifically at Russia and Ukraine, what lessons should organizations take from the way cyber operations have been used alongside wider strategic goals?
I think there's a lot of learnings in there, but if I were to summarize, for me at least, my personal takeaway, physical and virtual warfare is no longer in isolation, right? We are living in a hybrid warfare era, and Russia, unfortunately, is leading in many aspects the way with that. We can see clear evidence with threat actors like APT-454 or Sandworm, APT-29, that are very coordinating their attacks together with the military arm in order to disrupt critical national infrastructure in ways to prepare for the physical world, a physical army to hit the targets in there. Right, so we are seeing aspects when it comes to service disruption, infrastructure impact, as well as pressure testing civil systems that exist in there, right? And these are really like spillover risk beyond the immediate battlefield.
Yeah. I think if anyone listened to our last podcast episode with Steve around critical national infrastructure, there's some really good takeaways there for sort of OT technologies and how that is targeted, and sort of some real top tips from Steve on how to sort of mitigate that risk. So I guess Iran is often discussed in the context of cyber operations and regional tension. From your perspective, what should organizations understand about the risks, and how do you recommend they approach them pragmatically?
When it comes to Iran, I think the difference compared to Russia is that Iran tends to be more espionage heavy, right? And they tend to target more specific individuals as part of their primary missions, right? So a lot of like the public cases that exist across like APTs like APT 34, 35, muddy water, and so on. It's really more geared toward like credential theft, but then surveillance and long-term access part of that. So again, I think Iran is an example here when it comes to what I mentioned earlier around identity being the entry point to the battlefield.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess those basics around detection response and readiness across sort of campaigns is important there, and sort of, yeah, and looking at that in terms of, I think they use predominantly proxy groups as well, so there's things there that maybe our listeners could sort of take away. Have you got any views on that at all, or what you think?
I think in general, what I see with all the adversaries that are out there, or the trend landscape, it boils down to not trying to build a plan for a specific APT or a specific country, because in reality, what matters is not what's necessarily just in the media getting covered, or what's the latest threat research in general terms, but what matters is what is the applicability of that to my organization, to my industry, right? Because very often you will find that in the specific instances, these missions, these campaigns are carried out by adversaries that are specifically focused on a industry, on a subsegment, or specific techniques, right? Where we need to get smarter then is understanding what is my organization's threat landscape, right? What is the risk profile around that? And then build the right security controls across people, process, technology for me, not trying to generalize it, but
Yeah,
being specific to it. So if I'm I don't know, an energy provider in Europe,
yeah.
I need to understand what does my threat landscape look like?
We do a lot of workshops as well within industry and verticals, and I think that's really good just to sort of like talk within sort of clients, sort of share best practices, and that always for us works quite well. So we do that at some of our events, roundtables. So if any of our listeners are interested in that, then we can by all means sort of bring that to life with other customers and verticals that suit your organization.
Before we jump back here, just a quick word on something which I think helps connect what we're discussing today. When geopolitics, regulation, and supply dependency shape the threat landscape, often the difference is visibility. And that's where CyberLab and Guardsix come in. Guardsix, formerly known as Logpoint, provides SIEM, SOAR capability, and log management designed to help organizations detect, investigate, and respond to threats faster. And as a Guardsix partner, CyberLab helps you get real-time capability in practice, from onboarding to use cases and fine-tuning those detections. If your organization is struggling for visibility and needs help with alert fatigue and how to sort of manage things such as SIEM and SOAR, then this is where we can help. And that's CyberLab, your trusted cybersecurity partner. Alongside Guardsix, we can help with those detections moving forward. Back to the episode.
So a lot of organizations struggle to turn nation state activity into something measurable. How do you recommend translating what's happening in the threat landscape into risk and prioritization and investment?
No, that's like I guess the 1 million euro, dollar, or whatever currency our listeners subscribe to
Bitcoin.
question.
Yeah, it could be anything. Yeah,
Could be anything. Ultimately, our line of business is risk management, right? So if I think about it from that aspect, we need to understand the the likelihood of these type of things for happening, right? And then build plans around that. I think it's important to be realistic that just like Rome was not built in one day, this is not going to be done in one day. And I would even go that far and say that from a cybersecurity perspective, doesn't matter if we talk like architecture, we talk like instant response processes, threat intelligence, the job is never done, right?
Yeah.
So if we talk about nation state attacks, we need to understand what is the likelihood of this to target my organization, right? No, not every organization in the world will be targeted by these nation state attacks, right? They might be if this is part of like a global campaign that they run, but it's very isolated, typically, or very targeted. So step one, understand likelihood, right? Can this actually happen to me? Should I anticipate this happening to me? If the answer is yes, then you look into what is my organizational readiness when this happens, right? And this could be a number of things, like from tabletop exercises to stress test things, all the way to your own employees to try things. Like, don't wait for the picture perfect. Get going, right? What's I guess atypical from a vendor to say is think deeply on what is it that you have and
Yep.
what is it that you need, right? Because only you can make that decision, right? And then bring in the right partners that can bring in the right vendors where needed, where it can complement your security strategy. It's your security strategy. It's not the vendors or it's not the partner strategy ultimately.
And I think you summarize it well there around how do we manage and mitigate risk. I think that's what we do as a whole, and that often starts for us. We see within maybe doing things like a NIST assessment initially, just to benchmark yourself against the industry standard, and that could just be a way of sort of like prioritizing what's important to you and your vertical and where your gaps are. Because what I see from those assessments is everyone is different, and you have different tools and technologies, and you might have a large team that can manage a lot of this, or you might be a small team that needs support. So I think my takeaway there would be manage that risk, but start with that sort of benchmark of where you're at. And then from there, you get those key decisions based off some of the key frameworks that we do.
100%. I mean, at the end, like if you don't know like where you start, it's pretty hard to build a credible plan on where you need to go, right? You need to establish the baseline so that you can understand, okay, if this is the base, where do we need to go? And then build a roadmap for it. Don't over-engineer it. What are the short-term quick wins? What do we need to do midterm? And where do we need to go long-term?
Some of those quick wins as well come out relatively low cost. I think often we talk of cybersecurity and we think big budgets and you need to be a large enterprise or a large public sector organization to sort of, spend money on some of the key tools. But often it can be, a low cost thing for your business that might actually help you the most. So again, it's not always big budgets when we talk about this. It is often the quick wins that will sort of give you the most coverage when it comes to managing that risk.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that even that far, like if I think about like what excited me to leave one of the bigger category leaders and join Guardsix was essentially also the focus on these lean security teams in Europe, right? I agree. Like it's not just about like people tend to think like cybersecurity products are like these super expensive, designed for Fortune 500 organization, and only they can do the job. Well, they can do the job for Fortune 500, sure, right? But if you then zoom into like specific industries, like critical national infrastructure, and then even within there, like think of like, I don't know, oil and gas, energy, and so on, right? Or you go like even out of CNI and you talk about like the mid-market, right? They don't have the capacity to operate these types of complex solution. They're looking for something much more simple to use, simple to operate, simple to run, that still gets them the
Yeah.
you can say the comfort, right, they need, right, in order to know that someone has their back.
Yeah, amazing. I think that's so true, and I feel that, and we're here to help, and that's what we try to do. You know, we're trying to manage that risk for you, be that sort of key organization that you sort of turn to when you need support, and often it's not those big budgets. You know, we can do things that tailor risk even on low budgets. Let's discuss data security. So when organizations talk about wanting control over their data, what does this actually mean in practice for control, compliance, and security? And where do you see that organizations get caught out?
I think today there is an assumption, a wrong assumption, which is, well, if I need cybersecurity capabilities or competencies or products, I have to go for a US or Israeli vendor. Well, if you think about the underneath reason, well, because most of the vendors in one way or another have their origins there. Now, that is not by default a bad thing, but it comes with pros just like it comes with cons, right? To me, especially in the world that we are navigating on today, a big concern is how much access, in theory, the US government can have on the data that are stored. And if you then think about like cybersecurity products, we tend to store a lot of critical proprietary information in these systems, right? So what I start seeing is from the market, from the customers and partners, when it comes to data sovereignty, that they're revisiting how much exposure US vendors should be in their supply chain, right? Because of things like the US Patriot Act, because of things like the US Cloud Act, right? And we've seen public cases where, for example, in France, where Microsoft has admitted that if needed, they have to grant access to the US government, irrespective if the data is hosted in their Azure data centers in the region, right? So I think that there's a lot of discussions happening now, and I can only imagine that this will continue to happen, especially like if you then layer in like all the geopolitical tension across like US, China, Europe with Russia, Iran with US, Israel. I think there will be a much bigger emphasis on data sovereignty. And we start seeing isolated, not only discussions, but evidence of that. If you look into, for example, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I think it was now 3-4 years ago, they announced that their data needs to stay within the country boundary, right, for their public sector organization, and they have encouraged the private sector to follow. And we start seeing similar discussions also in Europe.
Yeah, and I think that leads us on to sort of those complex supply chains. You kind of touched on it there. So I guess how should leaders evaluate those dependencies, and what actions generally improve security, compliance, and control? Because that for me is an area that we have with hack risk along sort of managing supply chain. But what's your view and take on that, Milad?
I think when you need to think about like the layers of it, right? If you think about like what do we need to run our businesses, reality is it will all trace back to some chips that are produced by US, by Chinese factories or companies, right? So I think there is a difference between what do we expect in terms of like data sovereignty, right? And protecting our proprietary data as much as possible. But then there's also the reality of running your business. What is important, going back to from a risk management perspective, mapping this journey out and being really clear inside the not just the CISO organization, but also to the management team, to the board, on what is actually our exposure as an organization to these foreign jurisdictions and to these foreign vendors, right? And then assess which of these risks is acceptable and which one are non-negotiable that need to be replaced.
Yeah, and it probably starts within sort of that procurement phase, I guess, where it's contracts, transparency. You discuss an escalation path. That tends to be where you might even start at that point of managing that risk when you're onboarding suppliers yourselves. And we see a lot where you might have had a historic relationship with a supplier, and you've had that maybe over 10 years. We see that maybe that now we probably do a little bit more due diligence, a little bit on that, just to vet organizations and make sure they work to the standards we expect. But you might have had a relationship for say 10, 15 years, and you may have not gone through that onboarding process as much as you might do now if you onboarded a new supplier and what risks they might pose to your business.
Yep, and that goes back to keep simulating, keep stress testing. Don't take the worst you can do is you just accept, well, we always done it this way.
Yeah.
Because I can bet with you, neither the the attackers will not say, "Oh, we tried it once, we will not try it again."
Yeah, exactly. So I guess this has been a great episode, and I've really enjoyed talking to you today. So if there was one key takeaway that you would give for our listeners and our audience at Milad, what would that be? If you could just give one sort of hot tip on what they can summarize from this episode, what would it be?
Well, one is difficult. I have a few, but I guess I can package it under an umbrella for you, and then I still squeeze in a few other things under that.
What?
I guess the umbrella is be aware on what is happening in the industry that you play in, right? And that is like the assume breach mindset. Now, in there, I would say few things important. One is you got to assume identity is already compromised, and you got to design your security controls as with that mindset. The second one is you got to think of, as you build the security control, on how do you essentially, for the blast radius that will happen, right? How do you contain it, right? So it's not just about prevention. It's about when the attacker is in your environment, how do you contain them in an area for as much as possible? Third would be, how do you eliminate telemetry blind spots, right? Is reality, right? Like there will be blind spots that you have. Go back to what's the baseline? What do we need to achieve? And then map what is the telemetry gap that you have in your systems, and then build a plan for that. Fourth would be, I've seen a game in our space, which is, oh my God, I have 800 detections, so I'm good. Quantity means nothing, right?
Yeah.
It's about the signal to noise ratio. It's about making sure that you have the right detections with the right quality. And that is much more impactful over volume, because the volume will just kill the team that needs to operate it. What matters is not if you have 800 detections and have, I don't know, 30,000 alerts per day. What's much more important is how do you get to a very high true positive rate with ideally even a less set of detections.
Yeah, and I think that leads into like alert fatigue, doesn't it? We see that a lot within organizations that maybe implement tools and technologies, and over time it becomes a bit of a challenge to manage. So again, I think a good takeaway there around managing quantities, and yeah, definitely something to factor in with alert fatigue for teams and how they manage it. So that concludes this episode of Tales from the CyberLab. Join us next time for a brand new episode. Until then, stay secure.